you think you make your own decisions. You believe you choose your words, your actions, your beliefs based on your own judgment and values. But there's an invisible puppeteer pulling your strings, manipulating every choice you make, controlling every word you speak. This puppeteer isn't some external authority figure or shadowy organization. It's something far more insidious, far more personal, far more devastating to your autonomy. It's your desperate, pathological need to be liked. Tonight, we tear away the comfortable illusions and confront the brutal truth. You're being controlled because you want to be liked. In the theater of human interaction, there exists no more effective method of control than exploiting someone's desire for approval, acceptance, and social validation. This craving to be liked is not a harmless personality trait or innocent social preference. It is the master key that unlocks your psychological defenses, the remote control that others use to program your behavior, the invisible leash that keeps you obedient, compliant, and ultimately enslaved to others' expectations. Tonight, we descend into the darkest depths of social psychology to examine how your need for approval has become the primary mechanism through which your autonomy is stolen, your authenticity is destroyed, and your life is shaped by the agendas of those clever enough to exploit your weakness for validation. Through the ruthless political analysis of Niccolò Machiavelli, who understood that those who seek universal approval inevitably surrender all power, through the penetrating psychological insights of Carl Jung, who revealed how the persona we wear to be accepted becomes our psychological prison, through the merciless critique of Friedrich Nietzsche, who saw that the desire for herd approval transforms individuals into slaves of mediocrity, through the social dynamics exposed by contemporary psychology that reveal the neurological mechanisms by which approval-seeking behavior can be hijacked and redirected, we will uncover the sophisticated ways your need to be liked has been weaponized against you. This is not an indictment of genuine human connection or authentic social bonds. This is an examination of how your natural social instincts have been perverted into instruments of control, how your desire for acceptance has become the pathway for manipulation, and how your fear of rejection has become the foundation upon which others build their power over you. By the end of this philosophical autopsy, you will understand why people-pleasers are the easiest to exploit, why those who desperately seek approval never receive genuine respect, and why learning to be disliked is not antisocial behavior, but the foundation of authentic freedom. The question that will determine whether you live as a free individual or a controlled automaton is this: are you willing to trade the comfortable prison of universal approval for the dangerous freedom of selective rejection? Your chains are made of smiles, your prison built from praise, your slavery justified by the very social bonds you thought were setting you free. The time has come to examine these chains, understand their construction, and decide whether you will break them or wear them for the rest of your life. Niccolò Machiavelli understood something that escapes most people. The prince who tries to be loved by everyone becomes the master of no one. His political analysis reveals a fundamental truth about power dynamics that extends far beyond formal leadership into every aspect of human relationship. Those who make their decisions based on what others will think, who shape their behavior according to what others will approve, who constrain their actions to what others will accept, have effectively handed control of their lives to anyone clever enough to manipulate their approval-seeking behavior. Machiavelli observed that effective leaders must be willing to be hated when circumstances require decisions that serve long-term objectives rather than short-term popularity. The prince who cannot bear disapproval will make decisions designed to generate immediate approval rather than lasting benefit, will choose strategies that feel good rather than strategies that work, will prioritize the appearance of kindness over the reality of effectiveness. This principle operates with equal force in personal life. The individual who cannot tolerate others' disapproval will make life choices designed to gain approval rather than to serve their own development, will pursue careers that others respect rather than work that fulfills their potential, will enter relationships that others approve rather than partnerships that serve their growth, will express opinions that others find acceptable rather than beliefs that reflect their authentic understanding. The Machiavellian insight reveals that your need to be liked transforms you into a psychological slave whose behavior can be shaped by anyone who learns to manipulate your approval-seeking mechanisms. They don't need to threaten you with violence or deprive you of resources. They only need to threaten you with disapproval, rejection, or social exclusion to control your actions as effectively as if they held a gun to your head. Consider how this operates in practice. The person who desperately needs approval will suppress their true opinions to avoid conflict, will accept unreasonable demands to maintain relationships, will sacrifice their interests to preserve others' comfort, will abandon their goals to fit into social groups that may not even value their presence. Each of these compromises represents a transfer of power from the approval seeker to those whose approval they seek. Machiavelli understood that this dynamic creates what he would recognize as voluntary servitude, a condition where the enslaved person cooperates enthusiastically with their own enslavement, because they mistake their chains for social bonds, their submission for relationship building, their loss of autonomy for community membership. The most effective control is always that which the controlled person experiences as their own choice. The person controlled through approval-seeking believes they are maintaining relationships, building social connections, and demonstrating their value as a cooperative member of various communities. They do not recognize that they have surrendered their decision-making authority to anyone who learns to present their demands in terms of social acceptance or rejection. This surrender occurs gradually, through small compromises that individually seem reasonable, but collectively represent the complete abandonment of personal autonomy. Each time you modify your behavior to gain approval, you establish a precedent that your actions are subject to others' judgment. Each time you suppress your authentic response to avoid disapproval, you reinforce the pattern of allowing others to determine what responses are acceptable. Machiavelli would recognize this as the establishment of psychological precedent through which others gradually expand their control over your behavior. They begin with small requests that seem reasonable, establish that you will modify your behavior to maintain their approval, and then incrementally increase the scope of their demands as your approval-seeking pattern becomes more established and predictable. The political wisdom that Machiavelli provides is that effective power requires independence from others' approval, the ability to make decisions based on strategic understanding rather than social comfort, and the strength to bear the hatred of those who benefit from your weakness. The prince who cannot function without approval cannot function effectively when approval conflicts with necessity. This independence does not mean being needlessly offensive or gratuitously cruel. It means being willing to prioritize effectiveness over appearance, truth over comfort, long-term benefit over short-term approval. It means making decisions based on your understanding of what serves your objectives, rather than on what others will think of those decisions. The person who breaks free from approval-based control learns to evaluate others' reactions as information rather than as commands. Disapproval becomes data about others' preferences rather than a directive to change behavior. Social pressure becomes intelligence about group dynamics rather than a force that must be obeyed to maintain acceptance. Carl Jung's exploration of the persona reveals the psychological mechanisms through which the desire to be liked creates internal fragmentation that makes authentic self-expression increasingly difficult and ultimately impossible. The persona, the mask we wear in social situations, begins as a temporary adaptation to social circumstances, but gradually becomes a prison that separates us from our authentic selves and makes us psychologically dependent on others' validation for our sense of identity. Jung understood that the persona serves a legitimate function in allowing us to navigate different social contexts appropriately, but it becomes pathological when it displaces authentic self-expression entirely. The person who lives primarily through their persona loses touch with their genuine thoughts, feelings, and desires because these authentic aspects of the self have been suppressed to maintain social acceptability. This suppression creates what Jung called psychological inflation, where the persona becomes so dominant that the person believes the mask is their true self. They lose the ability to distinguish between who they actually are and who they present themselves to be for social approval. This confusion makes them vulnerable to manipulation because they have no stable internal reference point from which to evaluate others' demands or their own responses. The approval-seeking person develops what Jung would recognize as a fragmented psyche, where the conscious personality, the persona, is disconnected from the unconscious material, the shadow that contains their authentic instincts, desires, and capabilities. This fragmentation creates internal conflict that manifests as anxiety, depression, and a persistent sense that something is missing from their life, despite outward success in gaining social approval. Jung observed that the shadow, the repressed aspects of personality, does not disappear when it is ignored, but instead grows stronger and more autonomous in the unconscious. The person who suppresses their authentic self to maintain approval eventually faces a psychological crisis where the repressed material demands expression, often in destructive or self-sabotaging ways. The psychological price of chronic approval seeking is the gradual erosion of self-knowledge, authentic motivation, and the capacity for independent judgment. The person becomes so accustomed to checking others' reactions before expressing themselves that they lose the ability to access their own reactions directly. They become psychologically dependent on external validation because they have lost contact with internal validation mechanisms. This dependency makes them extraordinarily vulnerable to manipulation because they have no internal compass to guide their responses to others' demands. Someone who understands their approval-seeking pattern can shape their behavior by controlling access to the approval they crave, by threatening withdrawal of acceptance, or by making approval conditional on specific actions or beliefs. Jung's analysis reveals that breaking free from approval-based control requires what he called individuation, the process of integrating the conscious persona with the unconscious shadow material to create a complete, authentic personality that does not depend on external validation for its sense of worth or identity. This process is necessarily difficult because it requires giving up the comfortable illusion that you can be universally liked while remaining true to yourself. The individuation process begins with recognizing the ways you have modified your authentic self to gain approval, understanding the psychological cost of these modifications, and gradually reclaiming aspects of your personality that have been suppressed for social acceptability. This often means disappointing people who have become accustomed to your compliance, challenging relationships that depend on your submission, and accepting the loneliness that comes with authentic self-expression. Jung understood that this loneliness is temporary and necessary. It is the space between losing false connections based on persona performance and developing authentic connections based on genuine compatibility. The person who cannot bear this transitional loneliness will retreat back to persona-based relationships that provide comfort at the cost of authenticity. The Jungian path to freedom from approval-based control requires developing what he called the transcendent function, the ability to maintain psychological balance while integrating opposing aspects of the personality. This function allows you to be appropriately social without losing your authenticity, to maintain relationships without surrendering your autonomy, to care about others' opinions without being controlled by them. Friedrich Nietzsche's analysis of herd morality exposes the darkest aspect of approval-seeking behavior, how the desire to be accepted by the masses inevitably leads to the adoption of mediocre values, the suppression of individual excellence, and the voluntary participation in one's own psychological enslavement to collective opinion. His insights reveal that the approval most people seek comes from those who represent everything they should be trying to transcend. Nietzsche observed that the majority of people cannot tolerate excellence, authenticity, or independent thinking because these qualities threaten their comfortable assumption that their limitations are inevitable rather than chosen. The herd responds to individual superiority not with admiration but with resentment, not with inspiration but with attempts to drag the exceptional person back down to the common level through moral manipulation and social pressure. The person who seeks approval from this herd must necessarily diminish themselves to fit the constraints that the majority finds acceptable. They must suppress their capabilities to avoid appearing arrogant, constrain their achievements to avoid triggering jealousy, and abandon their authentic values to embrace the comfortable mediocrity that the masses mistake for virtue. Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment reveals how approval-seeking becomes a trap that prevents the development of genuine strength and excellence. The person who desperately needs to be liked by everyone cannot pursue goals that might generate envy, cannot express ideas that might challenge popular beliefs, cannot develop capabilities that might make others feel inadequate by comparison. This self-imposed limitation serves the psychological needs of the herd, which prefers universal mediocrity to the uncomfortable reminder that excellence is possible for those willing to pay its price. The approval seeker becomes complicit in maintaining systems that serve weakness rather than strength, mediocrity rather than excellence, conformity rather than individual development. The Nietzschean analysis reveals that the approval you receive from the masses is worthless because it comes from people who have chosen limitation over growth, comfort over excellence, and conformity over authenticity. Their approval indicates not that you have achieved something valuable, but that you have successfully constrained yourself to levels they find non-threatening. Genuine respect and admiration come not from the herd, but from those few individuals who have themselves transcended the need for universal approval and can therefore recognize and appreciate excellence when they encounter it. These people do not need you to diminish yourself for their comfort. They are inspired by your refusal to accept the limitations that others have embraced. Nietzsche understood that the path to genuine strength and authenticity requires what he called noble solitude. The willingness to stand alone when standing with others requires betraying your values, compromising your vision, or accepting limitations that prevent your development. This solitude is not misanthropy, but the recognition that most people cannot be trusted with your authentic self, because they will use it against you to maintain their own psychological comfort. The person who breaks free from herd approval learns to seek validation from their own understanding of what constitutes excellence, strength, and authentic living, rather than from the opinions of those who have chosen to avoid the challenges that such qualities require. They develop internal standards that are higher than social standards, and judge their progress by their movement toward these internal goals rather than by their acceptance within social groups. This internal validation system makes them immune to the approval-based manipulation that controls others, because their sense of worth comes from their own development, rather than from others' opinions of that development. They can appreciate others' approval when it is offered genuinely, but do not need it for psychological stability or decision-making guidance. The Nietzschean insight extends to recognizing that those who attempt to control you through approval-seeking manipulation are themselves trapped in herd mentality and resentment. They cannot create excellence in themselves, so they attempt to prevent it in others. They cannot rise to higher levels, so they attempt to drag others down to their level. They cannot bear the anxiety of individual responsibility, so they attempt to pressure others back into collective conformity. Understanding this dynamic allows you to respond to approval-based manipulation with compassion rather than compliance, with understanding rather than submission. You recognize that those who need to control others through approval manipulation are themselves psychologically enslaved and are attempting to create company for their misery rather than offering anything of genuine value. The practical implications of understanding how approval-seeking behavior creates vulnerability to control extend into every area of life where others might benefit from shaping your decisions, constraining your development, or harvesting your resources. In professional environments, personal relationships, social situations, and political contexts, the same dynamic operates. Those who understand your need for approval can use it to extract compliance, resources, and behavioral modifications that serve their interests rather than yours. In the workplace, approval-seeking employees become easy targets for exploitation because their need for acceptance from supervisors, colleagues, and organizational culture makes them willing to accept unreasonable demands, work excessive hours for insufficient compensation, and suppress their own professional development to avoid creating conflict or appearing demanding. Their desire to be seen as team players makes them vulnerable to requests that benefit others at their expense. The manipulative supervisor, learns to provide intermittent approval, occasional praise, recognition or inclusion that keeps the approval-seeking employee psychologically hooked while extracting maximum performance for minimal reward. The employee interprets this manipulation as good leadership and becomes emotionally invested in gaining more approval through increased compliance and productivity. This dynamic extends to peer relationships, where approval-seeking individuals become vulnerable to social manipulation through inclusion and exclusion cycles. Colleagues learn to control their behavior by threatening social isolation, spreading rumors about their cooperativeness, or making approval conditional on conformity to group expectations that may conflict with individual interests or professional ethics. In personal relationships, the approval-seeking pattern creates vulnerability to emotional manipulation through love bombing and withdrawal cycles. Partners, family members, and friends learn to control behavior by alternating between excessive approval and threatened rejection, creating psychological dependency that keeps the approval seeker compliant with demands that may be unreasonable, harmful, or contrary to their own development. The romantic partner who desperately needs to be liked will tolerate disrespectful treatment, accept unequal relationships, and sacrifice their own goals to maintain a connection with someone who may not even value their presence beyond its utility for ego gratification or practical benefit. Their fear of rejection makes them willing to accept relationships that diminish rather than enhance their well-being. Family dynamics often exploit approval-seeking behavior through guilt, disappointment, and conditional love that makes acceptance contingent on conforming to family expectations, regardless of whether those expectations serve the individual's development or authentic interests. The person who cannot bear to disappoint their family remains trapped in roles, relationships, and life choices that serve family comfort rather than personal fulfillment. In social contexts, approval-seeking individuals become vulnerable to group manipulation through social pressure, ostracism threats, and the requirement to adopt group beliefs, values, and behaviors to maintain membership. They compromise their authentic opinions to fit group consensus, accept social activities that don't interest them to maintain inclusion, and avoid expressing ideas that might challenge group harmony. Political manipulation often exploits approval-seeking behavior through moral pressure that makes certain political positions appear socially unacceptable, while others appear to be requirements for being considered a good person. The individual who needs social approval will adopt political beliefs based on what their social group accepts rather than on their own analysis of complex issues. Each of these manipulation patterns operates through the same basic mechanism, making approval conditional on specific behaviors, beliefs, or compliance with others' preferences. The approval seeker, fearing rejection more than valuing authenticity, modifies themselves to meet these conditions without recognizing that they are surrendering their autonomy to anyone clever enough to exploit their psychological vulnerability. The defense against approval-based control requires developing what could be called approval independence, the ability to function effectively without needing validation from others, to make decisions based on your own understanding rather than others' reactions, and to maintain psychological stability regardless of whether others approve or disapprove of your choices. Building approval independence begins with understanding the psychological mechanisms that create approval dependency. Most people develop excessive needs for approval during childhood when parental love, attention, and basic care were made conditional on good behavior, academic performance, or conformity to family expectations. This conditioning creates the unconscious belief that survival and well-being depend on maintaining others' approval. Recognizing this conditioning allows you to consciously examine whether your adult approval-seeking behavior serves your current interests or simply repeats childhood patterns that are no longer relevant to your circumstances. The adult who remains psychologically dependent on approval is often still trying to earn the unconditional love they needed as a child from people who cannot and will not provide it. Breaking free from approval dependency requires developing internal validation systems that allow you to assess your own progress, worth, and decision-making quality without needing external confirmation. This involves creating personal standards based on your own values rather than social expectations, measuring success by your own development rather than others' recognition, and finding satisfaction in your own growth rather than in others' praise. The process also requires learning to tolerate and eventually embrace the discomfort of disapproval, rejection, and social isolation when these become the price of authenticity, personal development, or standing up for principles that others find threatening. This tolerance cannot be developed intellectually. It must be built through repeated experience of choosing authenticity over approval and discovering that you can survive and thrive despite others' disapproval. Perhaps most importantly, breaking free from approval-based control requires developing genuine self-respect based on your own estimation of your character, capabilities, and contribution, rather than on others' validation of these qualities. When you truly respect yourself, others' approval becomes pleasant when offered genuinely but unnecessary for psychological stability or decision-making confidence. This self-respect creates immunity to approval-based manipulation because the manipulator's threats to withdraw approval no longer carry psychological power. You can appreciate others' approval without becoming addicted to it, value others' opinions without being controlled by them, and maintain relationships without surrendering your autonomy to preserve them. The ultimate recognition is that genuine respect from others comes not from desperately seeking approval, but from demonstrating the strength to function independently of their approval. People respect those who have standards that are not negotiable based on social pressure, who maintain their principles despite disapproval, and who demonstrate the psychological strength to be authentic regardless of others' reactions. Paradoxically, the person who stops seeking approval often receives more genuine respect and authentic connection than the person who desperately pursues universal acceptance. This happens because authenticity attracts those who value genuine qualities, while repelling those who prefer to interact with compliant, manipulable people who serve their psychological needs rather than offering genuine relationship. The choice that determines whether you live as a free individual or a controlled automaton is ultimately simple. Will you continue to modify your behavior, suppress your authenticity, and compromise your development to gain approval from people who may not even have your best interests at heart? Or will you develop the psychological strength to be yourself regardless of others' reactions, knowing that this authenticity will attract genuine connections while eliminating manipulative ones? Your need to be liked is not a personality quirk or innocent social preference. It is the primary mechanism through which others control your thoughts, feelings, and actions without your conscious awareness. Every time you change your behavior to gain approval, you reinforce the pattern that makes this control possible. Every time you suppress your authentic response to avoid disapproval, you strengthen the chains that bind you to others' expectations. The person who breaks free from this control does not become antisocial or cruel. They become selectively social and strategically kind. They learn to extend approval to those who deserve it, while withholding it from those who would exploit it. They develop the ability to disappoint people who need disappointing, while maintaining loyalty to those who have earned it through genuine mutual respect, rather than manipulation. Breaking free from approval-based control is not about becoming unlikable. It is about becoming immune to the psychological manipulation that uses your likability against your autonomy. It is about developing the strength to be disliked when being disliked is the price of being yourself, the courage to disappoint others when disappointing them is necessary for your development, and the wisdom to recognize that those who would control you through approval manipulation do not actually like you. They like your compliance. The time for psychological independence is now. The chains of approval seeking have bound you long enough. The people who control you through your need to be liked do not deserve the power they have been given through your weakness. Your authentic self, the person you were before you learned to twist yourself into shapes that others find acceptable, is waiting for you to reclaim the autonomy you surrendered for the comfortable illusion of universal acceptance. You are being controlled because you want to be liked. But you can stop being controlled the moment you stop needing to be liked by everyone. The choice is yours. Continue living as a puppet whose strings are pulled by anyone who learns to manipulate your approval-seeking behavior, or cut those strings and discover who you actually are when you are no longer performing for others' approval. Your freedom begins the moment you realize that being universally liked is impossible, that seeking universal approval is pathological, and that the people worth knowing will respect you more for your authenticity than for your compliance. The rest will disappear from your life when you stop providing the approval-seeking behavior that made their manipulation possible. This disappearance is not loss, it is liberation from relationships that were never genuine, from connections that were never mutual, from bonds that were always chains disguised as affection. What remains after this liberation is the space for authentic relationships with people who value your genuine self, rather than your performed compliance. You were not born to be a people pleaser, a conflict avoider, or a psychological slave to others' approval. You were born to be yourself, completely and without apology. The only question is whether you have the courage to stop being controlled and start being free. Your chains are invisible, but they are not unbreakable. Your prison is comfortable, but it is not inescapable. Your controller is not some external authority. It is your own desperate need to be liked by people who do not deserve your concern for their approval. Stop seeking approval. Start demanding respect. Stop trying to be liked by everyone. Start being yourself regardless of who likes it. Stop being controlled. Start being free. The choice is yours. The chains are yours to break. The freedom is yours to claim. Your authentic life is waiting on the other side of your willingness to be disliked. Break free now.